Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history in Montana. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. The winter of 1874 was particularly harsh in Blackwood County, Montana. Heavy snowfall had blanketed the rugged landscape by mid-October, unusually early even for this unforgiving territory. The small mining settlement of Crow's Ridge, nestled between the foothills of what locals called the Whisper Mountains, had become effectively cut off from neighboring towns. Only the most determined travelers would attempt the treacherous pass during these conditions. It was during this isolated period that the Blackwood Mining Company reported what would first appear to be a routine incident. 5 men had failed to emerge from Shaft 7 at the expected hour. The company ledger, preserved now in the Helena Historical Society archives, lists their names simply as Thomas Grayson, foreman; Edward Miller, support engineer; Joseph Hardin, explosives handler; and brothers William and Frederick Connors, general laborers. What makes this case particularly unsettling isn't merely the disappearance itself, but rather the conflicting accounts that followed, and the disturbing series of events that unfolded when a rescue party finally located the men 3 days later. According to company records, all 5 miners were found alive, though in a state described only as greatly disturbed. The company doctor, Harrison Wells, noted in his medical log that the men showed no signs of physical injury beyond minor scrapes and bruising consistent with routine mining work. Yet within 6 months of their rescue, 4 of the 5 men would be dead under circumstances that officials at the time found convenient to classify as unfortunate but unrelated incidents. Only Frederick Connors would survive beyond that period, though many who knew him would later question whether what remained could truly be called living. The Crow's Ridge incident stands as one of the most perplexing cases of collective trauma ever documented in the early territorial mining operations of the American West. What truly happened during those 3 days in Shaft 7? The official company report offers little insight, having been partially damaged in a courthouse fire in 1892, conveniently eliminating key pages of testimony. In this documented account, we will attempt to reconstruct the events leading up to, during, and following what miners throughout Montana would come to call the Long Dark of Shaft 7. The following narrative has been compiled from surviving company records, personal correspondence, newspaper clippings, medical reports, and testimonies gathered by regional authorities. Some details remain lost to time, while others seem deliberately obscured by those who perhaps wished certain truths to remain buried. Crow's Ridge began as most mining settlements did in that era, with promise and desperation in equal measure. Gold had been discovered in the creek beds in 1871, but it was the copper veins that eventually drew serious investment. By 1874, the Blackwood Mining Company had established a significant operation, employing nearly 70 men in various capacities. The settlement itself consisted of approximately 40 structures: the company office, a general store, a rudimentary medical station, a saloon that doubled as a gambling house, and simple housing for workers and their families. Thomas Grayson had arrived in 1872 with experience from the Pennsylvania coal mines. Company records describe him as methodical, reserved, and possessed of natural leadership qualities. He was promoted to foreman after just 4 months. Married with no children, Grayson maintained a small cabin at the settlement's eastern edge. His wife, Margaret, taught reading to the few children in the settlement and kept detailed household accounts that have provided historians with valuable insights into daily life in Crow's Ridge. In her personal diary, Margaret noted changes in her husband's demeanor approximately 2 weeks before the incident. "Thomas returns from the mine with a heaviness I've not seen before," she wrote on October 2, 1874. "When pressed, he speaks only of difficulties with the new shaft, saying the men report strange acoustics that disrupt their work. He has requested additional support beams, though the company engineer insists they are unnecessary. Edward Miller, the support engineer mentioned in the records, had been with Blackwood Mining Company since its inception. A former military man who had served briefly during the Civil War, Miller was described as technically proficient but prone to excessive caution in his employment file. His expertise regarding mine structural integrity was generally respected, making his apparent dismissal of Grayson's concerns particularly noteworthy. At 37, Miller was older than most of the miners and lived alone in quarters provided by the company. According to personal correspondence found among his effects after his death, he had been engaged once before coming west, but his fiancée had died of typhoid fever in 1866. Colleagues described him as intensely private but reliable. His notebooks, partially preserved in the company archives, reveal a methodical mind with a particular interest in the geological composition of the mining region. In the weeks leading up to the incident, his entries show increasing preoccupation with what he termed anomalous rock formations encountered in the newest excavations. Discovered unusual banded material approximately 200 yards into the western extension, he wrote on September 30th. Black, with streaks of copper-colored material, but not matching any known copper ore. Hardness exceeds normal parameters. Sample resists standard tools. A later entry dated October 10th notes, Foreman Grayson reports unusual sounds near the formation. I have explained that tunnels often produce acoustic anomalies due to their shape and composition. However, I must admit the particular quality of the echoes in that section is unlike anything in my experience, almost as though the sound returns altered in some subtle fashion. We'll conduct further tests when operational schedule permits. Joseph Hardin left behind little personal documentation. Company records indicate he was hired in early 1874 after previous experience in Nevada silver mines. His primary responsibility involved calculating and placing explosive charges to extend the mining shafts. The local saloon keeper's ledger shows Hardin settled his outstanding tab 3 days before the incident, paying in full an amount that would have represented nearly 2 weeks' wages. Hardin was known in the settlement as a man of few words, but considerable skill with explosives. Fellow miners described him as particular about his work, often spending hours calculating precise charge placements to maximize efficiency while minimizing risk. The company doctor's records indicate Hardin sought treatment for persistent headaches beginning in late September, describing them as a constant pressure, as though my skull were being squeezed in a vice. Dr. Wells prescribed willow bark tea and noted that Hardin appeared unusually agitated, speaking of vibrations in the rock that no one else could feel. The Connors brothers, William and Frederick, were among the youngest employees at the operation. Aged 23 and 21 respectively, they had traveled west from Ohio seeking opportunity. Letters sent to their parents, now preserved in the Montana Historical Society collection, reveal ambitious young men determined to build their fortunes. William, the elder brother, frequently mentioned plans to eventually start his own mining venture. Frederick's correspondence focused more on the harsh working conditions and the strange qualities of their current assignment. We've been moved to the new shaft, Frederick wrote on September 28th, just over 2 weeks before the incident. The work is no harder than before, but there's something about this particular tunnel that sets the men on edge. William says it's just the way sound carries in the narrow passage, but I'm not convinced that explains the odd vibrations we sometimes feel through the rock. The foreman seems troubled as well, though he keeps his concerns private. Yesterday, Miller, the engineer, spent nearly an hour taking measurements at the far end of the tunnel, though he claimed it was merely routine inspection. In another letter dated October 8th, Frederick wrote, "The new section has yielded something unusual. Not gold or copper, but a strange black stone that appears almost polished where it's been exposed." Miller becomes quite animated when examining it, taking numerous samples and making sketches in his notebook. Hardin complains of headaches whenever we work near it for extended periods. William remains unaffected, and mocks the rest of us for our unease. Yet I've noticed even he has taken to pausing his work occasionally, pressing his hand flat against the tunnel wall as though feeling for something through the stone. What exactly triggered the events of October 17th remains unclear. The weather log kept by the company office noted particularly heavy snowfall beginning around noon, with rapidly dropping temperatures. Work in Shaft 7 had begun at the standard hour of 6 a.m., with the crew expected to emerge for their midday meal around noon. When they failed to appear, initial concern was minimal. Delays were not uncommon, especially when promising veins were discovered. By 3 p.m., however, Company Supervisor Elijah Barrett dispatched 2 men to check on the team. According to their subsequent report, they found the entrance to Shaft 7 partially obstructed by fallen support beams. They called into the darkness but received no response. Fearing a more significant collapse, they returned to report the situation rather than attempting to clear the obstruction themselves. Barrett organized a proper rescue party, consisting of 6 men with appropriate tools and supplies. Progress was slow, as they needed to secure the tunnel as they advanced. Company records indicate they worked through the night, finally clearing the obstruction around 5 a.m. on October 18th. Beyond the collapsed section, they found the tunnel intact but empty, with mining equipment abandoned in what appeared to be an orderly fashion. Oil lamps had been extinguished, not simply gone out. Tools were arranged in their proper places. There were no signs of panic or sudden flight. The rescue party continued deeper into the shaft, finding a junction where the main tunnel split into 3 narrower passages. According to their testimony, they called out repeatedly, but heard no response. They noted, however, what they described as a peculiar quality to the echoes that made it difficult to determine from which direction sounds originated. After brief deliberation, they split into 3 pairs to investigate each passage. The pair that entered the leftmost tunnel returned quickly, reporting that it extended only about 30 feet before ending in solid rock face. The center team progressed approximately 100 yards before likewise reaching a dead end, though they noted recent blasting marks, suggesting the tunnel had been actively extended just before the incident. It was the third team, exploring the rightmost passage, who made the discovery that would confound investigators for years to come. Approximately 200 yards into the narrowing tunnel, they found all 5 missing men. The official report describes them as seated in a rough circle, facing one another, apparently uninjured, but in a state of profound unresponsiveness. None reacted when addressed by name or when touched. Their eyes were open, but, as one rescuer described, seemed to be looking at something none of us could see. James Whitley, one of the rescuers who first discovered the men, provided additional details in a personal letter to his brother, written 2 days after the incident. "I've seen men injured, sick with fever, even dead, but never anything like this. They sat so still I first thought they might indeed be dead, despite their open eyes and upright postures. But they were breathing, slow and steady. What disturbs me most was their arrangement, perfectly equidistant from one another, hands resting palms up on their thighs, as though they'd positioned themselves with careful measurement. No mining crew at rest would ever sit so formally. And something else. Though their lamps were extinguished, the men's pupils were contracted, as if in bright light. When I passed my own lamp before their faces, there was no change in their eyes. Whatever they were seeing, it wasn't the darkness of that tunnel. The men offered no resistance when helped to their feet. They walked when guided, but would not speak or otherwise acknowledge the rescue party. Their oil lamps were present but extinguished, raising the question of how long they had been sitting in absolute darkness. Perhaps most puzzling was the complete absence of any tools or equipment in the area where they were found, despite the clear evidence of recent mining activity. Fresh blast marks on the rock face approximately 20 feet beyond their position. Whitley's letter continues, "We found no tools with them, which makes no sense. A mining crew doesn't simply set aside their equipment, especially in a section actively being worked. We eventually located everything, picks, shovels, blasting equipment, neatly arranged at the junction where the tunnel splits. It was as though they had deliberately carried everything back to that point before returning to the far end, empty-handed. The rescue party guided the 5 men back through the tunnel system and to the surface, where they were immediately taken to the company medical station. Dr. Wells conducted initial examinations and recorded his observations in a medical log that survives today, though with several pages conspicuously removed. The physical condition of all 5 subjects appears normal, he wrote. No signs of injury beyond minor abrasions consistent with their occupation. Respiration, pulse, and reflexes all within expected parameters. They accept water when offered, but show no interest in food. The most concerning aspect is their continued silence and apparent detachment. They follow simple instructions but offer no verbal response to questions. Pupils react normally to light, suggesting no physical trauma to the brain, yet their psychological state remains profoundly altered. What happened next marked the beginning of the truly disturbing phase of the Crow's Ridge incident. After approximately 6 hours in this unresponsive state, Thomas Grayson suddenly began to speak. According to witnesses, he sat upright on his cot, looked directly at Dr. Wells, and said with perfect clarity, "It's still there. It's still listening." He then fell into what Wells described as violent seizures that required multiple men to restrain him. When the seizures subsided, Grayson appeared to return to normal awareness. He recognized his wife when she was brought to him and seemed confused by the concern surrounding his condition. When questioned about what had happened in Shaft 7, he claimed to have no memory of anything unusual. According to his statement recorded by Barrett, the team had been extending the rightmost tunnel when they decided to take a brief rest. That was the last thing he recalled before finding himself in the medical station. Within hours of Grayson's apparent recovery, the other 4 men similarly awoke from their unresponsive states. Each claimed no memory of anything unusual occurring in the mine. Each described deciding to take a brief rest, and each expressed confusion about why they had been brought to the medical station. None could account for how they came to be sitting in a circle in the darkness, nor could they explain why their equipment had been neatly stowed elsewhere in the tunnel system. One detail not included in the official report, but noted in Dr. Wells' personal journal, concerned the men's initial responses upon regaining awareness. Each man, upon first speaking, asked the identical question, "How long were we gone?" Not "What happened?" or "Where am I?" but specifically how much time had passed. When told it had been 3 days since they entered the mine, each displayed the same expression, not surprise or confusion, but what I can only describe as resigned confirmation, as though this information matched some internal calculation. Dr. Wells kept the men under observation for 2 days before declaring them fit to return to their homes, though not yet to work. In his final notes on the incident, he wrote, "While I can find no medical reason to keep these men confined, I remain troubled by the identical nature of their accounts and their collective amnesia regarding roughly 72 hours. The synchronized return to awareness likewise defies conventional medical explanation. I have recommended to Supervisor Barrett that Shaft 7 remain sealed pending further investigation, though I doubt the company will sacrifice potential profits for long." A previously overlooked notation in Wells' records indicates he conducted additional examinations during the observation period. All 5 men exhibit unusual patterns when asked to draw simple shapes, he wrote. When requested to draw a circle, each produces instead a similar spiral form. When asked to draw a straight line, each creates a pattern of connected angles. Most striking is their complete unawareness of this deviation. Each insists they have drawn exactly what was requested. Additionally, all 5 now display an uncanny ability to tell the precise time without reference to a watch or clock, even when kept in rooms without windows. This faculty extends to naming the exact minute and second when asked, with consistent accuracy when verified against my own timepiece. Wells' prediction proved accurate. Company records indicate that Shaft 7 was reopened on October 25th, just 1 week after the rescue, though with a different crew assigned to the work. The 5 men involved in the incident were granted 2 weeks recovery time on half pay, a relatively generous accommodation for the era, suggesting perhaps that company officials were more concerned than they publicly acknowledged. It was during this recovery period that the first indications emerged that whatever had happened in Shaft 7 was far from resolved. Margaret Grayson's diary entries from late October describe her husband's increasing restlessness and insomnia. Thomas paces through the night, she wrote on October 27th. When he does sleep, he wakes shouting about pressure and depth. Last night I found him standing at our table, using a knife to carve strange patterns into the wood. When I spoke his name, he looked at me as though I were a stranger. A subsequent entry dated October 30th elaborates, "The carvings Thomas makes grow more complex. They resemble nothing I recognize, not letters nor pictures, nor any symbol I've ever encountered. Yet he works on them with such precision, measuring distances between lines with his fingers, starting over if the spacing is not to his satisfaction. When I asked what they represented, he said they were translations of what he either could not or would not say. He has begun to speak of time in an odd manner, referring to deep time and stone time, as though these were commonly understood concepts. Yesterday he asked if I could hear the humming in the walls. There was no sound I could detect." Similar accounts came from the boarding house where the unmarried miners resided. Joseph Hardin reportedly spent hours staring at the walls of his room, occasionally pressing his ear against them, as though listening for something. The proprietress noted that he would often mutter about messages in the stone before falling silent when observed. A fellow boarder, Michael Collins, later testified that he once entered Hardin's room unannounced and found him writing in a small notebook. The page was covered in what looked like musical notation, but not any conventional sort I recognized, Collins stated. When Joseph noticed me, he slammed the book shut and became agitated, demanding to know if I'd been sent to monitor him. He used that specific phrase, not spy on or check on, but monitor. When I explained I had only come to borrow matches, he calmed somewhat, but insisted on speaking in whispers for the remainder of our conversation, claiming it can hear through the air just as well as through the earth. Edward Miller, who had private lodgings near the company office, became known for taking long walks at night, regardless of the increasingly harsh weather. The local night watchman reported encountering Miller standing motionless in the snow near the sealed entrance to Shaft 7 on at least 3 occasions. When approached, Miller claimed to be conducting acoustic tests, despite having no equipment with him. A search of Miller's quarters after his death revealed dozens of pages filled with complex mathematical calculations and diagrams. These papers were briefly examined by a professor from Helena College before being claimed by company representatives and subsequently lost. The professor's notes describe the materials as containing elements of advanced acoustical theory well beyond current scientific understanding, particularly regarding the transmission of sound waves through solid materials. Many calculations relate to what Miller termed sympathetic frequencies and harmonic resonance in crystalline structures. The mathematical notation itself becomes increasingly unorthodox in later pages, employing symbols I cannot identify from any known mathematical system. The Connors brothers, who shared a small cabin, withdrew almost entirely from community interaction. Frederick later testified that during this period, his brother William would often sit for hours carving small objects from pieces of scrap wood. "They all looked like the same thing," Frederick stated. "Though I couldn't tell you what that thing was supposed to be. When I asked him, he said he was just making what he'd seen in the dark." A neighbor, Sarah Townsend, reported visiting the brothers' cabin to bring them food at Margaret Grayson's request. "The place was transformed," she later told the local constable. "Every available surface was covered with those carvings William had been making. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of them, arranged in precise patterns across the floor and tables. Frederick seemed embarrassed by the display, but William spoke of it as important work. He claimed they were helping him remember something essential that he'd learned in the mine, but couldn't quite recall in full. Most disturbing was when he held one of the objects to his ear like a seashell and insisted he could hear voices through it. Frederick quickly showed me out after that, apologizing for his brother's behavior. On November 12th, approximately 3 weeks after the incident, Thomas Grayson was found dead in his home. The official cause of death was recorded as apoplectic fit, what we might now recognize as a stroke or heart attack. However, Margaret Grayson's final diary entry, dated the same day, suggests a more disturbing end. He would not stop digging. For 3 days he has been tearing up the floorboards, saying we need to go deeper. This morning I woke to find him clawing at the dirt with bleeding hands, whispering that name over and over. When I tried to stop him, he looked through me with those same empty eyes from when they first brought him home. I am afraid of what has taken residence in my husband. The diary ends abruptly with that entry. Historical records indicate Margaret Grayson left Crow's Ridge the day after her husband's funeral, returning to her family in Pennsylvania. She never remarried and, according to a cousin's correspondence found in the Pennsylvania State Archives, would never speak of her time in Montana except to say that some things should remain buried. A document discovered among the personal papers of Elijah Barrett adds a disturbing detail absent from official records. According to Barrett's private notes, Thomas Grayson's body was found not merely dead, but in a condition that defied simple explanation. The doctor claims apoplexy, Barrett wrote, but I have seen men die of such before, and they do not expire with their fingernails worn to the quick, with dirt packed beneath what remains of them, with their eyes fixed open in such evident terror, nor do they typically expire while surrounded by a perfect circle of that strange, black mineral we've been finding in the new shaft. Margaret claims no knowledge of how the mineral samples came to be in their home, arranged with such precision around her husband's body. I have instructed the men who prepared the body for burial to speak to no one of what they saw, and I have personally disposed of the mineral samples in the deepest part of Shaft 6, now abandoned. Some things are not meant for official reports. Joseph Hardin was the next to die on December 3rd. His body was discovered at the bottom of a narrow ravine approximately 2 miles from the settlement. The initial assumption was that he had become disoriented in a snowstorm and fallen accidentally. However, tracks in the fresh snow indicated he had walked directly to the edge and apparently stepped off deliberately. More troubling was the small leather-bound notebook found in his coat pocket, containing page after page of what appeared to be the same phrase repeated in increasingly erratic handwriting. It speaks through the stone. The notebook, now housed in the Montana State Archives' restricted collection, has been examined by linguistics experts in recent years. According to their analysis, what initially appeared to be a single repeated phrase is actually a text written in at least 7 different alphabets, including Standard English, Greek characters, what might be a form of cuneiform, and several unidentified symbolic systems. The content, where translatable, appears to describe methods of communication across vast distances using crystalline structures as transmission media. Later pages contain what seem to be precise geographic coordinates for locations across the globe, many corresponding to significant mineral deposits or geological formations. The final pages of Hardin's notebook contain a passage written in conventional English, though the handwriting differs notably from earlier entries. They think I took my own life. This assumption serves my purpose. The vessel is failing. The human form was not designed to carry what I now contain. A new vessel awaits. I go to it willingly. The work continues through other hands. We reach across time, across space. We have always been here, in the deep places. Now we remember ourselves. Edward Miller survived until late January 1875. His death came under particularly disturbing circumstances that sparked brief interest from authorities beyond Crow's Ridge. According to the report filed by Supervisor Barrett, Miller had convinced 2 junior engineers to accompany him into Shaft 7 after working hours, without company authorization. A search party was organized when all 3 failed to report for work the next morning. The 2 junior engineers were found near the entrance to the shaft, both unconscious but alive, suffering from what appeared to be the effects of gas exposure, a common hazard in poorly ventilated mines. Miller's body was discovered much deeper in the tunnel system, near the junction where the original 5 had been working in October. The cause of death was officially recorded as asphyxiation due to inadequate ventilation. Yet several inconsistencies troubled investigators. Miller had brought sophisticated surveying equipment with him, including what was described as a peculiar brass device of apparent scientific purpose that no one at the company could identify. This device was positioned carefully on the ground near his body, apparently aligned with specific points on the tunnel walls that Miller had marked with chalk. Most notably, Miller had used a mining pick to carve a series of symbols into the rock face, symbols that bore a striking resemblance to the patterns Thomas Grayson had carved into his table weeks earlier. The brass device disappeared from the company office where it had been stored, pending investigation. A clerk reported seeing Supervisor Barrett removing it late one night, though Barrett denied any knowledge of the object when questioned. The 2 junior engineers, upon recovering consciousness, provided conflicting accounts of what had happened. One claimed they had gone no further than the main tunnel before being overcome by gas. The other insisted they had followed Miller to the junction, where he had set up his equipment and begun taking measurements while muttering about frequencies and resonance. Neither could explain how Miller had traveled so much deeper into the shaft alone, especially as their oil lamps would have extinguished in the oxygen-depleted environment that supposedly killed him. A letter from one of these engineers, Samuel Perkins, to his father, suggests the official account omitted significant details. What they're saying about gas in the tunnel is a convenient explanation, but far from the truth, Perkins wrote. There was air enough to breathe, and our lamps burned steady. What stopped Davis and me from following Miller deeper was something altogether different, a sensation like a physical barrier made of sound, if such a thing is conceivable. We could see Miller moving ahead, setting up his instruments, but when we tried to follow, the pressure against our ears and eyes became unbearable. Miller seemed unaffected. The last thing I recall before losing consciousness was Miller kneeling before the rock wall, pressing both hands against a section of black stone veined with copper. He was speaking, not to us, but to the stone itself, as one might address another person. His final words, which still echo in my nightmares, were, "I understand now. I am ready to serve as conduit." Then came a sound like the mountain itself was drawing breath, and darkness took me. Perkins and Davis both left Crow's Ridge within days of recovering consciousness. Company records indicate they received substantial severance payments, unusual for such junior employees, with signed agreements not to discuss the incident. Perkins's letter to his father is the only known account of their experience to have survived. William Connors, the elder of the brothers, was the 4th to die. On February 8, 1875, a fire broke out in the cabin he shared with Frederick. Neighbors responded quickly, managing to control the blaze before it spread to other structures, but William did not survive. The official report noted that the fire appeared to have started near the wood stove, a common enough occurrence in winter. However, Frederick's subsequent account suggested a more deliberate act. According to a statement given to the local constable, Frederick had awoken to find his brother arranging dozens of the small wooden carvings he had been creating in a circle around himself. William had then doused the circle with lamp oil and set it alight. Frederick managed to escape the cabin and raise the alarm, but claimed William made no attempt to flee, instead sitting calmly amid the growing flames. Sarah Townsend was among the neighbors who responded to the fire. In a letter to her sister in Denver, she wrote, "The scene defies rational description. The cabin was fully engulfed when we arrived, yet through the windows we could see William, seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by fire yet seemingly untouched by it. His expression was one of perfect serenity, even as the flames climbed higher around him. Then, as we watched in horror, he began to change. I hesitate to commit this to paper for fear you'll think grief has affected my reason, but I swear on our mother's grave that William's form appeared to fragment, breaking apart like sand crumbling in water, until nothing remained but ash and those strange wooden objects which somehow survived the blaze unscathed. Frederick saw it too. He has not spoken a word since that night. Frederick Connors was thus the sole survivor of the 5 men involved in the original incident. His account of what happened during those 3 days in Shaft 7 changed several times in the years that followed. Initially, he maintained the same story as the others, that the team had simply stopped for a rest and had no memory of anything unusual. After his brother's death, however, he began to speak more openly about experiences that the company and local authorities had apparently pressured the men to keep private. In a letter to his parents dated March 1875, Frederick wrote, "I can no longer maintain the falsehood we agreed upon. What happened to us in that shaft was not natural, and I believe it is killing us one by one. We had been working the new tunnel for hours when Joseph set the charges to extend our progress. The blast revealed something embedded in the rock face, a dark, striated formation unlike any mineral I've seen before. Thomas thought it might be a new copper deposit and ordered us to excavate around it carefully. As we exposed more of the formation, we began to feel something, not a sound exactly, more like a pressure inside the head. Edward said it was just the poor air quality affecting our thinking, but I believe now it was the beginning of its influence. The formation seemed to pulse, though I know that sounds impossible. We all saw it. We all felt drawn to it. Thomas reached out to touch it, and that's when everything changed. I cannot describe adequately what followed. Time seemed to distort. We found ourselves sitting in a circle facing the formation, though none of us remembered arranging ourselves that way. We could hear each other's thoughts, see through each other's eyes, and something else was there with us, moving through our minds like a fish through water, examining, probing. 3 days passed as minutes. When we heard the rescue party calling, it was as though we were awakening from a shared dream. Whatever had been communicating with us withdrew, but not completely. It left echoes, fragments. Each of us carried away pieces of it and of each other. I know things about Thomas and Joseph and Edward that they never told me. I see William's nightmares when I close my eyes. The company forced us to sign statements denying anything unusual had occurred. They sealed that section of the tunnel not for safety reasons, but to study what we found. Edward had been helping them, making trips into the shaft at night to take measurements. He told William that the formation was growing, spreading through the surrounding rock like roots. I believe that whatever we encountered is still reaching out, still influencing us. Thomas began digging because it told him to go deeper. Joseph threw himself into that ravine because he couldn't bear the constant whispering. William said he needed to burn out the infection. I fear I will be next, unless I put as much distance as possible between myself and that place. A subsequent letter, dated April 1875, contains even more disturbing revelations. I dream of it constantly now, not just the black stone, but what lies beneath or behind it. We glimpsed only the smallest extension of something vast, something that exists primarily in dimensions we cannot perceive. It showed us visions of structures beyond human comprehension, lattices of crystal and thought that span continents, networks of consciousness flowing through the deep earth like blood through veins. The others embraced what it offered. Thomas saw patterns of mineral deposits that would make him wealthy beyond imagination. Joseph perceived principles of energy that would revolutionize his work with explosives. Edward recognized mathematical truths that would elevate him to scientific prominence. William saw beauty pure and terrible. He wanted to become part of that beauty. I alone resisted, though I cannot claim this as courage. It was simple fear that held me back, fear of losing myself entirely. The others gave themselves willingly, opening their minds to its influence. That's why they were affected more severely, why they died while I survive. But my resistance means the connection remains incomplete. I remember fragments, glimpses, while they remembered too much. It communes through crystal structures in stone, a network spanning the globe, ancient beyond reckoning. It was here before humans walked upright, will remain long after we've returned to dust. Not malevolent as we understand the term, but utterly indifferent to human concerns. We are brief sparks to it, our lives measured against epochs of stone. It offered knowledge, but the price was selfhood. The others paid willingly. I continue to refuse, though the whispers grow louder each day. Frederick Connors left Crow's Ridge shortly after writing this letter. Historical records indicate he traveled first to Denver, then to San Francisco, before ultimately booking passage on a vessel bound for Australia in late 1875. What became of him afterward remains largely unknown, though a journal attributed to Frederick Connors surfaced in a Sydney antiquarian bookshop in 1962. If authentic, it suggests he changed his name and established himself as a sheep farmer in rural New South Wales, where he lived until at least 1903. The journal chronicles Connors' attempts to escape the influence of what he encountered in Shaft 7. He writes of moving his residence frequently, of avoiding mines and caves, of his reluctance to enter any enclosed space. He developed elaborate rituals involving iron objects placed at compass points around his sleeping area, believing the metal somehow interfered with the transmission. He never married, explaining that he feared passing the contamination to offspring. Most entries describe ordinary farming activities, suggesting Connors found some measure of peace in his new life. However, occasional passages reveal the persistent trauma of his experience. "Dreamed of the circle again," reads an entry from 1888. "The five of us seated as before, but this time I could see what flowed between us, filaments of light or energy connecting our minds, with thicker strands extending back into the rock face. William was nearly translucent in the dream, more conduit than man. He saw me watching and smiled. 'It's still growing,' he said, 'still reaching. You cannot hide from something that speaks through the bones of the world.'" The final entry in this journal, dated April 17, 1903, reads, "It found me again. After all these years and miles, I felt it stir in my thoughts yesterday. The same pressure behind the eyes, the same whispered calculations. I wonder if they finally excavated it completely, or if it simply grew strong enough to extend its reach across oceans. I've instructed Robert to burn my body when I die. No burial, nothing in the ground. The earth is too good a conductor." As for Shaft 7 itself, Blackwood Mining Company records indicate it was permanently sealed following a structural assessment in March 1875. The company ceased operations entirely at Crow's Ridge by the end of that year, citing depletion of viable ore deposits as the official reason. Most of the settlement was abandoned shortly thereafter, though a small community persisted in the area until around 1890, primarily engaged in logging rather than mining. An internal company memorandum discovered among financial records donated to the Montana Business Archives in 1927 suggests the decision to abandon the site was motivated by factors beyond economic considerations. While the board remained skeptical of the more fantastical elements in Supervisor Barrett's reports, the document states, the cumulative evidence of unusual occurrences at the Crow's Ridge operation cannot be dismissed entirely. The unexplained deaths of 4 employees, the increasingly erratic behavior of remaining workers, and the documented anomalies in mineral compositions from Shaft 7 all contribute to a situation that poses unacceptable risk to both personnel and company reputation. It is therefore recommended that the operation be terminated and all equipment of value removed from the site. Shaft 7 is to be sealed permanently with reinforced concrete, and all records pertaining to the incident of October 1874 are to be segregated from general company archives and held in the chairman's private files. The incident might have remained merely an obscure footnote in Montana's mining history had it not been for a geological survey conducted in 1949. The University of Montana commissioned a study of the region's mineral deposits, sending a team to map the abandoned mine systems using modern equipment. According to Dr. Alan Pritchard, who led the expedition, their magnetometer readings showed significant anomalies in the vicinity of what their maps identified as the sealed Shaft 7. The instruments went haywire in that specific area, Pritchard wrote in his field notes. We initially suspected a large iron deposit, but the pattern of disturbance was unlike anything I've encountered in 30 years of geological work. It seemed to pulse with a regular periodicity, almost like a heartbeat. We attempted to take core samples, but found the equipment would invariably malfunction when directed toward the anomaly. Pritchard's team eventually located the sealed entrance to Shaft 7, though decades of weathering had partially concealed it beneath soil and vegetation. They noted that the timber and stone blocking the entrance appeared to have been reinforced multiple times over the years, most recently with what seemed to be concrete dating from the 1920s, suggesting someone had maintained the seal long after the mine's abandonment. One team member, graduate student Eleanor Walsh, kept a personal journal during the expedition. Her entries provide additional context missing from the official reports. Dr. Pritchard won't include this in his formal documentation, she wrote on June 12, 1949. But everyone on the team has been experiencing unusual dreams since we began working near the sealed shaft. The dreams share common elements: darkness, circular arrangements of objects or people, whispered voices that seem to originate from inside the head rather than being heard through the ears. Dr. Hoffman actually walked in his sleep last night, and we found him attempting to remove the seal from the mine entrance with his bare hands. When awakened, he had no memory of leaving his tent. Walsh's journal continues. The local man we hired as a guide refuses to approach the shaft area. He claims his grandfather worked briefly at Crow's Ridge in the 1880s and warned that the place was tainted. According to family stories passed down, the miners who died after the incident in Shaft 7 weren't properly dead. Their bodies functioned, but something else was wearing them like clothes. The guide says several local families maintain an informal watch on the area, checking periodically to ensure the shaft remains sealed. Dr. Pritchard dismisses this as superstition, but I've noticed he's become increasingly obsessed with the magnetic anomalies, spending hours adjusting equipment and taking readings even as the rest of us grow more uneasy. The survey team made no attempt to breach the seal, but set up monitoring equipment to record the magnetic anomalies over a 72-hour period. The resulting data showed clear patterns that defied conventional geological explanation. Perhaps most disturbing were the audio recordings made using sensitive microphones placed against the sealed entrance. When enhanced and filtered, these recordings contained what multiple team members described as whispering voices, speaking in what sounded like multiple overlapping languages. Linguistic analysis conducted at the university could identify elements that resembled English, Latin, and possibly Blackfoot or Crow indigenous languages, but much remained indecipherable. The most commonly repeated phrase appearing in multiple recordings was translated simply as deeper. Dr. Hoffman, the sleepwalking team member mentioned in Walsh's journal, subsequently published a brief article in an obscure academic periodical specializing in acoustic phenomena. The article, titled Subterranean Resonance Patterns in Abandoned Mining Systems, makes no direct reference to Shaft 7, but describes experiments with crystalline formations that exhibit unusual properties of sound transmission and potential storage. Hoffman theorizes that certain mineral structures might be capable of recording sounds from their environment and replaying them under specific conditions, a primitive natural analog to electronic recording technology. The article was largely ignored by the scientific community, and Hoffman left academia shortly thereafter, taking a position with a private research foundation whose records remain sealed. The survey team's findings were compiled into a report submitted to the university in early 1950. According to correspondence found in the university archives, the report was reviewed by several faculty members who recommended no further investigation of the site. One reviewer, whose name has been redacted from the surviving documents, wrote, "While Dr. Pritchard's observations are methodically recorded, his interpretations venture into realms beyond scientific plausibility. I strongly advise against publishing these findings or conducting follow-up studies, as they would only damage the department's academic reputation." The report was subsequently classified as speculative and archived without publication. Dr. Pritchard reportedly resigned his position at the university shortly afterward. His personal papers, donated to the Montana Historical Society after his death in 1968, include extensive notes on what he termed geomagnetic consciousness and lithic transmission of thought patterns, concepts that mainstream geology has yet to embrace. Among these papers was a letter Pritchard apparently wrote, but never sent to a colleague at Princeton University. "I am increasingly convinced," he wrote, "that what we encountered at the Crow's Ridge site represents a phenomenon entirely new to science, or perhaps entirely ancient and simply forgotten. The patterns of magnetic fluctuation matched precisely the brainwave patterns we measured among team members experiencing the unusual dreams, suggesting some form of interaction between the geological formation and human consciousness." Most compelling was our discovery, on the final day of the expedition, of a small crystalline sample partially embedded in the concrete seal. Under microscopic examination, this crystal exhibited a structure unlike any known mineral, with an apparently artificial lattice formation that could not have occurred naturally. When placed near an electromagnetic field, the crystal produced modulated output that, when fed through an oscilloscope, generated patterns identical to those we recorded from the sealed shaft itself, as though the sample were somehow connected to or communicating with the larger formation still sealed within the mine. I have kept this sample for private study, contrary to university protocols. I find myself reluctant to share it with colleagues, feeling a strangely personal connection to the object. It seems almost to respond to my thoughts, particularly when I handle it directly. I have begun to experience visions or perhaps memories that cannot possibly be my own, impressions of vast networks extending through the Earth's crust, of communication systems operating on principles entirely alien to human technology, of intelligence that exists on timescales so vast that a human lifetime registers as less than a heartbeat. The letter ends abruptly mid-paragraph, with no indication of whether Pritchard ever shared these observations with anyone before his death. A handwritten note attached to the letter, apparently added by whoever organized his papers for donation, states simply, "The crystal sample referenced in this document was not found among Dr. Pritchard's effects." His death certificate lists cause as cerebral hemorrhage, though colleagues reported increasingly erratic behavior in his final months, including claims that he could hear the earth thinking. In 1964, a forest fire swept through the region, destroying much of the remaining evidence of Crow's Ridge's existence. Aerial surveys conducted in the aftermath, however, revealed a curious feature: a perfect circle of unburned ground, approximately 50 feet in diameter, centered on the location where Shaft 7 would have been. Soil samples taken from this circle showed abnormally high concentrations of copper and several rare earth elements, along with an unidentified black mineral that crystallized in unusual striated patterns. A U.S. Geological Survey team briefly investigated the anomaly as part of a broader study of the fire's impact. Their report mentions the unburned circle only in passing, attributing it to possible mineral concentrations affecting soil moisture levels, and thus creating natural firebreak conditions. However, internal communications obtained through a later Freedom of Information request reveal more complex findings deliberately omitted from the public report. The mineral samples from Site CR7 demonstrate properties that warrant further specialized study, wrote Dr. Victor Lang, the team leader, in a memo marked for limited distribution. Specifically, the black striated material exhibits conductivity patterns that fluctuate without apparent external cause. When isolated in a controlled environment, samples show temperature variations, electrical discharge events, and, most notably, emission of electromagnetic radiation in narrow frequency bands that correspond to no known natural or artificial source. Most concerning are the effects reported by technician Davis after prolonged handling of the larger samples, specifically vivid dreaming, auditory hallucinations, and what he described as memories that aren't mine. I recommend immediate quarantine of all samples and restricted access to the collection site pending consultation with appropriate specialists. No record exists of such consultation ever taking place. The samples were reportedly transferred to a specialized facility for analysis, but subsequent requests for information about their disposition have been met with claims that no such materials exist in government inventories. The last official record concerning Shaft 7 comes from a brief Montana Highway Department survey in 1967, conducted as part of planning for a new road through the area. The survey notes simply, "Previous mining tunnel entrance in Sector G7 shows signs of recent disturbance. Concrete seal appears to have been partially removed and then replaced. Matter referred to local authorities. No record exists of any follow-up investigation by those authorities." The planned highway was eventually rerouted to avoid the area entirely, officially due to unstable ground conditions, though internal memoranda suggest concerns about unexplained equipment failures and worker complaints of disorientation and auditory hallucinations when operating in the vicinity. John Whitaker, a Highway Department engineer who participated in the initial survey, later provided an unofficial account to a local historian researching the Crow's Ridge incident. "What the official report doesn't mention," Whitaker stated, "is that we found clear evidence someone had been systematically attempting to reopen the shaft. The original concrete seal had been partially drilled through in a precise pattern, holes arranged in a perfect circle near the perimeter. Most peculiar was that each hole contained the same object, a small wooden carving, cylindrical with irregular protrusions, inserted so that one end made contact with whatever lay beyond the seal. When I removed one for examination, the wood was warm to the touch despite the cool air temperature, and seemed to vibrate slightly, as though conducting sound or energy from one side of the barrier to the other. We reported the situation to our superiors, and were promptly reassigned to a different survey area. Before leaving, we photographed the site and the carvings, but when the film was developed, every frame showing the shaft entrance was overexposed to the point of uselessness. I later heard rumors that a specialized team was dispatched to reseal the entrance with reinforced materials, but I can't confirm this directly. What I can tell you is that several members of our survey crew, myself included, experienced unusual dreams for weeks afterward, dreams of sitting in dark circular chambers, of voices speaking through stone, of patterns that seemed meaningful during sleep but impossible to recall upon waking. Today, the exact location of Crow's Ridge and Shaft 7 has been largely reclaimed by the Montana wilderness. The coordinates recorded in various historical documents lead to an unremarkable forested hillside showing little evidence of human activity. The University of Montana Mining History Department lists the site as location uncertain, presumed lost, and discourages amateur exploration attempts. Yet local residents occasionally report unusual phenomena in the general area: compasses that spin without settling on a direction, electronic devices that drain their batteries unexpectedly, and most commonly, the sensation of being watched from among the trees. Hikers sometimes describe hearing what they believe to be distant voices or machinery operating deep underground, particularly at night or during storms. Perhaps most unsettling are the small carved wooden objects occasionally found by hunters, and hikers, objects that bear a striking resemblance to descriptions of the carvings William Connors obsessively created before his death. These objects, roughly cylindrical with irregular protrusions and deep grooves, don't appear to represent any recognizable animal or symbol. When collected and brought out of the forest, they reportedly deteriorate rapidly, becoming unrecognizable within days. In 2008, an amateur mineralogist reported finding an unusual black stone with copper-colored striations while hiking in the general vicinity of the former Crow's Ridge settlement. He described the sample as unusually heavy for its size and noted that it seemed to affect electronic equipment, causing his digital camera to malfunction and his GPS device to display impossible coordinates. Before he could have the stone properly analyzed, it allegedly disappeared from the locked display case where he had stored it. In a curious postscript to this account, the mineralogist reported subsequently experiencing unusually vivid dreams involving circular chambers and whispering voices, similar to those described by others who had encountered materials from the area. A small but dedicated group of researchers continues to investigate the Crow's Ridge incident, collecting historical documents, oral histories, and physical evidence related to the events of 1874 and their aftermath. Their findings, published in specialized journals and websites devoted to historical anomalies, suggest patterns linking the Crow's Ridge phenomenon to similar incidents at mining sites across the globe. Cases where workers reported unusual mineral formations, experienced missing time or altered consciousness, and subsequently exhibited behavioral changes or unexplained abilities. Dr. Elizabeth Chen, a geophysicist who has studied several such cases, proposed in a 2015 paper that certain rare mineral formations might indeed be capable of affecting human consciousness through as yet unidentified mechanisms. While mainstream science remains skeptical, she wrote, the consistency of reports across cultural and historical contexts suggests something beyond mere superstition or mass hysteria. The prevalence of specific elements in these accounts, circular arrangements, perception of time distortion, subsequent infection of thoughts, and the apparent ability of the phenomenon to spread beyond its original location points to a genuine, if poorly understood, interaction between certain geological formations and human neurological systems. The story of what happened to the 5 miners of Shaft 7 in October 1874 remains incomplete. Official records offer contradictory information. Key documents have been lost or deliberately destroyed, and the few first-hand accounts diverge in significant details. What seems clear is that something was discovered in that narrow tunnel beneath the Montana earth, something that profoundly affected those who encountered it and continues to cast a shadow over the region nearly a century and a half later. For those inclined toward rational explanation, the incident might be attributed to gas exposure causing shared hallucinations, followed by trauma-induced psychological breakdown. The subsequent deaths could be seen as tragic but coincidental, or perhaps the result of untreated mental illness in an era with limited understanding of such conditions. For others, the Crow's Ridge incident suggests something far more disturbing, the possibility that something ancient and utterly alien was disturbed by human intrusion, something that could somehow influence human minds, that could whisper across time and distance, that perhaps still waits in the darkness beneath the Montana soil. What remains undeniable is the effect the incident had on those involved. 5 men entered Shaft 7 on an ordinary October morning. Within 6 months, 4 were dead under troubling circumstances. The lone survivor fled as far as he possibly could, yet apparently believed that whatever they encountered had somehow followed him across an ocean. In his final academic paper, never published but found among his personal effects, Dr. Alan Pritchard perhaps came closest to articulating the true horror of the Shaft 7 incident. What if consciousness is not exclusively a property of living tissue? What if awareness can manifest in other substrates? in stone that has been compressed for millions of years, in metals subjected to the Earth's magnetic field for eons. And what if such an awareness, operating on timescales vastly different from our own, were suddenly disturbed after countless millennia of isolation? Would it not reach out, try to understand its discoverers in the only way available to it, by reaching into their minds, by attempting to reshape their thoughts to match its own incomprehensible patterns? And once having touched human consciousness, might it not find the experience intriguing? The Blackwood Mining Company ceased operations entirely by 1876. Its records were eventually acquired by larger mining concerns and now rest in various historical archives. The company's final annual report made no mention of the Shaft 7 incident specifically, but included a curious addendum to its standard safety protocols. Under no circumstances shall unusual mineral formations be disturbed without proper scientific consultation. Any worker experiencing unexplained auditory or visual phenomena underground is to report immediately to surface supervision. No independent exploration of abandoned or sealed tunnels is permitted under penalty of immediate termination. No worker shall remain underground for periods exceeding 12 consecutive hours under any circumstances. Frederick Connors, if the Sydney Journal truly was his, lived out his life far from Montana, yet never escaped the shadow of what happened in Shaft 7. His final known writing suggests a man still haunted decades later. I dream of sitting in that circle night after night. Sometimes I'm Thomas, sometimes Joseph, sometimes myself. The perspectives shift, but the presence remains constant. It moves through us, learning, adapting. In the dream, I always realized too late that we didn't discover it. It summoned us, called us deeper into the earth, until we found exactly what it wanted us to find. And now it's out there, moving through human thoughts like currents through wire, listening, always listening. The hills above where Crow's Ridge once stood remain strangely devoid of development, despite the region's growth over the past century. Local residents generally avoid the area, offering vague explanations about poor hunting, difficult terrain, or simply an unwelcoming atmosphere. Maps of the region sometimes show curious blank areas or inconsistent features, as though cartographers struggled to accurately represent the landscape. Perhaps there is nothing there now but trees and stone and the quiet weight of history. Perhaps whatever was found in Shaft 7 has long since been removed, studied, and cataloged in some governmental repository. Or perhaps it remains, waiting in the dark beneath the Montana soil, sending its whispered messages through the stone, reaching out to any mind receptive to its call. For those who study the darker corners of history, the Crow's Ridge incident raises disturbing questions about what else might lie undiscovered beneath the Earth's surface. The miners who entered Shaft 7 that October morning in 1874 were simply doing their jobs, extending humanity's reach into the planet's resources. They could not have anticipated that in some places, digging too deep might disturb something better left undisturbed, something that, once awakened, might never truly sleep again. If you find yourself in the remote forests of western Montana, in the shadow of what locals still sometimes call the Whisper Mountains, pay attention to the sounds around you. If your compass needle begins to waver, if you feel a strange pressure behind your eyes, if you think you hear voices carrying on the wind, remember the miners who never truly left Shaft 7. And perhaps consider walking in the other direction. As for the geological anomaly that presumably still exists at the site, no official study has been conducted since the aborted highway survey of 1967. Satellite imagery shows only unbroken forest, though certain instruments reportedly detect unusual energy signatures centered on the area. Perhaps it is merely a natural phenomenon as yet unexplained by modern science. Perhaps it is something else entirely. Frederick Connors wrote in his purported journal, "They will find it again someday. Humans always dig, always reach for what glitters in the dark." I only hope that when they do, they recognize what we did not, that some things look back when discovered, some things reach back, and some hungers, once awakened, are never satisfied. In 2014, a graduate student researching the history of mining operations in Montana claimed to have discovered previously unknown documents related to the Crow's Ridge incident in a private collection. Before he could publish his findings, however, he abruptly abandoned his studies and reportedly moved to New Zealand. His academic advisor received a brief email stating only, "Some history should remain buried. I hear it now. The whispering. It knows I've been looking. I need to get as far away as possible." The student's research materials were never recovered. His former colleagues report that in the weeks before his departure, he had become increasingly paranoid, covering the walls of his apartment with complex diagrams and speaking of patterns in the static whenever he used electronic equipment. His current whereabouts remain unknown. Whatever the truth of Shaft 7 and the 5 miners who encountered something in its depths in October 1874, their story remains one of the most disturbing documented cases in Montana's history. A reminder that the frontier's dangers were not limited to harsh weather, wild animals, or human conflicts, but sometimes included threats from places no human was meant to go and things no human was meant to find. Recent advances in geological scanning technology might one day reveal what truly lies beneath the site of Crow's Ridge, but some local preservation groups actively oppose such investigation, citing environmental concerns. More candid members of these organizations, speaking off the record, express a different motivation. Some things are sealed away for good reason. The old families around here, the ones with connections going back to the mining days, they pass down stories about what happened at Shaft 7. They maintain the watches, checking the site periodically. They understand what outsiders don't, that curiosity isn't always a virtue, especially when dealing with things that might be curious about us in return. The land remembers. The stone remembers. And sometimes, in the deep places of the earth, that memory takes forms we cannot comprehend until it's far too late. The miners who never truly left Shaft 7 stand as a warning across time, a reminder that some discoveries cannot be undone, and some knowledge once gained can never be forgotten. It waits still, perhaps, in the darkness beneath Montana, listening, always listening,